We'll get started. I don't know. We have give like 2 more minutes of leeway, and then we'll start this session. Um, Actually, in my head, I said let's start it when 21 people are or 20 people are here, and there seems to be 20 people. So we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone to coming to this team science crash course. My name is Dr. Christopher Visa, and I will be your facilitator this afternoon. So before we get started, we're going to have a couple of workshops on March 31st and April 14th. So be on the lookout for announcements about those sessions. They're going to be a little bit more specific. We're pretty sure they're going to be on these topics, leadership and coordinating between multiple teams. But when you get the announcement, that will be the final topic these team scholars have chosen to present on. So before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. I graduated from the University of Central Florida, where I primarily studied teams and how teams work together. I went to a postdoc with it was a dual postdoc with Purdue and the University of Pennsylvania. And then I went to warmer climates again, becoming an assistant professor here at Georgia Tech. Recently, I've been elected onto the board of directors at Insights, which is the international network for the science of team science. So we're giving out information on how awesome team science is. My general research interests revolve around promoting worker well-being in all aspects, role transitions, experiences, like when you transition from work to work, between meetings and stuff, as well as high stakes teams. This research focuses on, say, human robot team collaboration. You can think of astronaut teams or military teams in this context, and sometimes your science teams can also be high stakes, and we'll be talking about them today. So here's kind of a brief overview of the purpose of the workshop. I'll have, we'll do a brief introduction into how teams work, and then we'll go into a little bit deeper discussion on how we understand teams. You could think of this workshop as an advanced organizer for those two upcoming workshops. So this is trying to give you as much foundation as you possibly can within 2 hours, and then we'll start for you to use in these subsequent workshops. An important point here is this workshop in particular is interactive. There'll be surveys, group discussions, things like that. So just want to share that with you before we get into that. Agenda today, these are the topics that we're going to be covering. It's always good to get everyone on the same page before you begin. So we'll be kind of sharing a language, basic teamwork concepts, so a mental model of a way to understand how teams work and teamwork. We'll go into 2 different input factors that make science teams succeed. We'll talk about decisions that you make during team formation, and then we'll touch on how effective leadership looks in these teams. And then we'll go into these mediators, which will highlight talking about managing, leveraging, and mitigating conflict in your teams, as well as promoting psychological safety. And why are we talking about this in terms of science? Well, it's important for a lot of different reasons. Selfishly, it's probably important for your it's critical for your tenure and promotion. You'll see that most universities are including interdisciplinary impact in their tenure and promotion language. And you never get tenure by yourself, right? You have a lot of undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, research scientists, and other colleagues that you work with in order to reach that goal. And teams generally are more productive than the individual. More publication and successful grant applications. And if you're looking to be interdisciplinary, which I think a lot of folks here are, they can be even more successful. There is also a greater demand from funders for language surrounding teams and team science, as well as interdisciplinary teamwork. You see that in these FOAs from NSF and NIH, and you see a lot in these new super big grants like the STCs or the interdisciplinary institutes and centers. They want to see something about team science and how folks will get along. And so that's why we're talking about it today. There's also these team science research organizations, these professional organizations. In-Group is one, and Insights is another. And I'll be sharing these slides for you to review later if you'd like. So let's get started real simple, like on your computer, your phone, whatever, we're going to be using Menti today. So if you would go to menti.com and enter the code that's currently on your screen, and just in a couple of words, express what a team is to you. And I'll switch sharing screens so we can see those responses come in.
Could you go back to the code? I'm sorry.
Sure, it's at the top of the screen too.
At the top. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's
Sorry.
also in the chat if anybody needs a direct link.
We're all about redundancy here. So we have some good answers coming in. Collaborative, a group of people from different backgrounds contributing and collaborating towards a common goal. I really like that one, as it has a very specific definition, right? You're focusing on a single goal of folks. This one too, perfect example of what teams do. A collection of people working together to accomplish the same goal. It seems like we all have a common goal here in terms of understanding what teams are. Accomplishing a task or vision, a group of people working together who have a common goal, effective, efficient, cooperative. These are all great descriptors of what a team is. I like this bit here about mutual respect. These are all great. Let's see if there's anything else, anything unique that comes up. No, but these are all fantastic ideas of what a team is, which will make my job just a little bit easier. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. Boom. Okay, so y'all were right on point for what a team is. Teams are a set of two or more individuals who are dynamic, interdependent, and work adaptively towards a common goal. There's a little bit more specific language in there. Specifically, they need to be able to work interdependently to accomplish a goal. They also operate in a multi-level context where you have a team and individuals are nested within that team, and there's usually some greater entity that these teams are operating within. That's important because they're influenced by both the individual factors and these top-down factors in terms of how to get along their performance, their coordination, and all of these different aspects. And generally, teams will substantially vary on what I'm trying to say is there's plenty of different types of teams. So we can have a team that has a lot of diversity with respect to background diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity, any of these factors. It can be homogeneous or heterogeneous on these things. They could be unidisciplinary in their background, or transdisciplinary. Their size can vary, their proximity can vary, whether or not their goals are aligned can vary substantially. And there's some good reading on this, which is the Enhancing the Effectiveness of Team Science, which goes into a lot of detail about these different dimensions and how they can affect teamwork. And we can skip over these very specific definitions here. Everyone has a different idea of how we should categorize these teams. You can think of it, one dimension that folks use is authority differentiation. So this is like whether or not you really have this top-down hierarchy within your team in terms of leadership, or is it really a flat team where everyone contributes equally? As you can see, that higher levels is higher on this, the lower levels is lower. You can also have teams vary in their skill differentiation, which are required skill sets of each team member who can perform various actions. On the low end, basically everyone can do anything on the job. People on the high end of skill, or teams on the high end of skill differentiation, are these really functionally diverse teams in which no one can really step up for someone else. And then you have temporal stability, right? Like, how long is this team going to be together? How long are they going to last? You have these like one-off short-term lab teams on one end, and then these real teams that we work on every day, where there's not necessarily a definitive date, but we know we're going to be continuing to work together for a prolonged period of time. These characteristics, I'm not just saying them for, like, here's a definition, write it down, and then you'll be quizzed on it later. These characteristics are important for you to know or identify in a team because it affects everyone's expectations, which in turn affects their behaviors in the team. So like a one-off project with low temporal stability, right? You may not invest in developing the interpersonal relationships with your fellow team members that will help develop these emergent states that affect your performance, like trust and psychological safety. It also affects how communication is delivered, right? In a very short-term project where you don't care, where you might not necessarily care about other people's feelings, you may engage in radical candor or being insensitive to them. Oops, sorry. There's also, it's important to know as a team member generally, like how decisions are made within your team. If your team has high authority differentiation, everything is probably incumbent upon the leader making the decision. While low authority differentiation within your team, you're probably making decisions as a collective and being more democratic in that sense. How much team members rely on one another. So as the example that I gave in the previous slide essentially is like, if there's low skill differentiation, then anyone can step in to fill someone else's role. And there may be expectations to do that. But if there's high skill differentiation, you can't really fill in someone else's roles because you don't necessarily have that expertise. And for those of you who are going to be leaders on the team, this is important for you to know, because many of these dimensions are perceptual in nature, like authority differentiation. So how decisions are made, who's responsible for what. As a leader, you influence the perception of your team members on these many of these characteristics. So it's up to you to really ensure the team has clear, concise, and consistent expectations for your team. Now, oops. What I'm going to introduce now to you is how we tend to think about teams within the organizational sciences, which is my background. So this is like just a framework for you to use when you are working on a team, evaluating a team, or thinking about how teams work. We use this input, mediator, outcome framework. So inputs are, outcomes are the things that we all know, right? These are, in our cases, the published articles, grant submissions, because who knows whether or not you're going to get a grant, and as well as your team's well-being, because that's important to make sure that you're influencing in a positive way as well. The list goes on here, maybe learning objectives for a classroom, or, something about conferences as well. The way we get to those things are through these mediators, and we separate mediators into these two different categories. We have processes and emergent states. Now, processes are the behaviors that you engage in. These are things that you can measure and know about sort of in the moment. Like, is there good communication within the team? Are the team members coordinating with one another, or is there a lot of conflict happening? Emergent states is something that teams don't come in with. These are things that develop over time, that take a lot of effort to develop over time and can break down over time. So there's psychological safety, which means that you feel free to be vulnerable in your team. There's trust in your team members, which is more task-based. Like, I can trust you to do this task for me and accomplish this goal so we can be more effective. And there's also cohesion as well. So these are more motivational, affective constructs, while the processes are actual behaviors. And it all has to start somewhere. So what affects these constructs are the inputs of the team. So this is factors of team composition, how big your team is, the leadership in your team. And this is only like a really high level view of some of the constructs that we study in team sciences. But this framework of inputs, mediators, and outcomes is something that you should be keeping in mind when you're thinking about building your team, revamping your lab, any of these sorts of, or building a team for a grant as well. So I'm going to be talking about some of the team composition variables. We'll talk about leadership as well. We'll touch on conflict, as I mentioned earlier, as well as psychological safety. We're not going to focus on the outcomes because I can't give you like team-based things that will get a grant submitted or a published article. But I can provide some information on the factors that lead to you accomplishing those goals. So first off, we'll start with team composition. And for this, we have a task for you all to do. So in the chat, if you don't see it, we'll share it again. You're imagining this scenario. You're a new assistant professor in organizational psychology, looking to form an interdisciplinary team, to study the psychological, physiological, and cognitive effects of commuting on work and families, and the implications this holds for infrastructure design. So what we're going to do is we're going to split you up into groups, I think of 3 or 4, maybe 4 or 5, depending on how things work out. And for the first 10 minutes, read over the material that you have been provided, and independently, without talking to your group members, pick your top 3 candidates. After that 10 minutes has elapsed, we'll send a message to everyone to start collectively discussing who you would like to finalize your pick for your team here. And you'll be responding on Menti again. So be sure to designate your group's response. Elect someone to, put the answers on Menti. But, elect someone to do that, and also like designate, like have some sort of phrasing or something so we know who is providing the response. So Lauren is creating those groups now. And we will break out soon.
We should be good to go if you want me to open them up.
Open up
Okay.
those rooms and we'll see you in about 25 minutes.
I might try pausing the recording.
Okay.
Everybody should be back in about 60 seconds.
Cool. Got 2 rooms, but two more rooms that we need from group 3 and group 4. Is everyone back? I can't.
Yeah,
Okay.
you should be good now. Okay, it just took a second. Everyone was kind of stuck. Everybody's
Yeah, I
back.
know. I saw that. I was like, what's going on? All right. Thanks, everyone. Sorry about the confusion initially about the activity. I hope it all got cleared up a little bit. I'll make a note for next time. But let's talk a little bit through some of the choices that you made for your group activity. So room 1, you were the speedy group. Does someone want to talk about why they selected these individuals for their team?
Okay, I guess I'll chime in. What we did is we went through the list and highlighted things in red that seemed like red flags, highlighted things in green that seemed like green flags. And then we tried to find a mix of disciplinary background. So one person's a navigation person, one person's transportation, and one person is aligned with the person running the team. Yeah, that was our process.
That's great. So you had that interdisciplinary sort of viewpoint. What sort of things did you highlight in the red and green?
Actually, let me pull it up and I can show you.
Sure.
Share. Oh, I can't screen share while you're sharing.
I could stop.
Oh, there we go. And so we grade out here. Most of the publications are single author. Seems like a red flag.
Yeah.
This person is severely strict. That seemed like a red flag. And this person is very focused on their own research.
That's great. That's probably the most systematic sort of review on this activity that I've seen. I'm so happy, like right now as a facilitator. This is great. So yeah, the green things were expertise as well. Also some team-based sort of characteristics, right? Has several co-authors. Red things also team-based. So this is really, really great way to do things of managing the pros and cons of each of the individuals. Are there any other comments you want to make on your decision-making process?
Anybody else? Because I didn't choose I kind of just wrote down what people were saying on the colors.
It was easier for us while Julie marked these are all this colorful, so we could choose actually based on her thought. Actually, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah, so a fantastic data reduction sort of technique on these things is that's awesome. Let me so group where is it? Here we go. Group 5, you were next. Who did you decide to pick and why? I mean, we know who you decided, but why did you decide to pick these folks?
We chose them because they had different areas of expertise and they had all expressed an interest in the project. We already knew, like, had some sort of history with them. You know their work or them specifically. And there was a good balance between those who had publishing records and grant funding and those who didn't.
That's good. So you didn't prioritize any particular characteristic. You were looking for maybe a match between them. Is that accurate?
Yeah, kind of a complementary balance.
That's perfect. Group 3, I'm guessing that's group 3. Or is it group 2 that actually had people in it? I can't remember.
I think we put in ours twice. We just didn't have a group name on one of them.
Okay.
Yeah, that was my fault. Sorry.
So group 4, do you want to add anything else to this?
I mean, so we came up with the same 3 names,
Right.
As the other group, and you know, we were looking at all of the same things that everyone else has already said in terms of expressed interest, potential availability, right, and focus on their own research versus more collaborative or interdisciplinary in terms of the other thing that and areas of expertise. So it's like we hit on the transportation like piece of it, the physiological measures, and looking for someone that was like maybe had more of a medical sort of orientation, but also attending to like the rank and the potential power dynamics. So senior folks who expressed interest, a junior person in the same level, the same area of content, who could sort of be like maybe more of a co-PI, where the more senior folks might be co-investigators if we're thinking about grants, or if we're thinking about like authorship and senior authorship versus junior, to try and keep the power dynamic a little bit more like balanced as well. So that was how we arrived. So very much aligned with what other folks were thinking about too, for sure.
Oh, that's great to hear, and that's exactly what this exercise is designed to do, is get you thinking about, we can skip this slide, like the sacrifices that you make, and it's more about the fit between folks. Like, did you only select senior scholars who might butt heads, or also like get in some junior scholars in there as well? Sorry. And did you sacrifice potential attitudinal problems for pedigree? Did you think about how these team members fit together with one another? Did you weigh personal information more heavily if you happen to know the person? So more, teamworky sort of stuff if you knew the person. So this exercise is not necessarily to develop the correct answer, because there's never necessarily one correct team configuration all the time. The three most important things to recognize here is that your personal biases may influence your decisions. So maybe you're more inclined to select someone with your own background, someone that you select, someone that you know, even if you don't realize that you have these sort of biases towards the selection process. Diversity is valuable. You've demonstrated that both on an interpersonal standpoint as well as a functional standpoint, so their backgrounds fitting together. And lastly, it's imperative that you consider fit. Now, the fit can be on a ton of different characteristics, like the personality of your team members. You can look at their extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness, openness, conscientiousness. All of these things predict team performance. Experience also predicts team performance. How long they've been working together, or how long they've been at a particular job, how long they've been at an organization, their educational background, etc. Size also matters, how many team members you have. And then also demographic characteristics, which are proxies for lived experiences, can be important. So you can have a diversity of points of views on a particular problem. So age, gender, and ethnicity are there. You always look at previous productivity when selecting team members, whether that's journal articles or whatever they have on their CV, any sort of activities that they've engaged in, as well as team orientation. Now, the problem with these is that many of them you're not actually measuring in a straightforward way, right? You can't say, hey, I'm thinking of considering bringing you onto a team. Can you fill out this personality measure to see if you're the right fit for what we have here? Actually, I'm just go back to that part. So a lot of the ways that you get some of these variables is looking through their CV and resumes, looking for experience and previous productivity and their team orientation. You can tell these things from, say, their team orientation from the number of authors on a publication and the diversity and roles in their publication. So they're sometimes first, sometimes last, sometimes in the middle, or they always first, always last, can speak indirectly to their team orientation. You always want to have interviews, whether formal or informal, with folks that you're bringing on. These interviews can give you indirect indicators of their personality, how well they are going to work in the team, and some of their lived experiences. It'll give you an indicator of how motivated they're going to be to work in the team in whatever role that you have expectations for them. For hiring new lab members or graduate students, right? You probably want to give them maybe writing samples if you're a research-oriented lab that's going to be pushing out a lot of publications or journals. Present them with scenarios, project management scenarios, if you have a lot of moving parts in your lab all the time, and that's going to be part of their responsibilities. One thing is, when you're doing these interviews, when it's appropriate, not when you're building a research team, but when you're bringing on, say, a postdoc or a graduate student, make sure that you're using structured interviews. So every single candidate should get the same questions. There's a research finding that went out and they surveyed a whole bunch of managers on structured interviews, which is all of the same questions to all of the applicants, in unstructured interviews where the manager chose what questions they would ask each candidate on an individual basis. 80% of these managers said that, hey, I think that structured interviews are better than unstructured interviews. But when asked what interview technique they use, 80% reported that they use unstructured interviews as opposed to structured interviews. So we kind of always overestimate our ability to make the right decisions in the moment when it's coming to selecting folks for our team. So even if you think, hey, I probably know better, just ask the structured interview questions so you have a comparative metric across each of the candidates that you're thinking about bringing into your lab. It's also important to ask targeted questions in these interviews. Say questions should be designed to get at the dimensions that you most value. If the position doesn't require a lot of coding skills, you shouldn't really be asking about that. If the position requires a lot of teamwork, which they typically do now, do you like working in a team? Do you like working alone or in a team? Which one do you prefer? And always ask why. You know, a lot of these questions have the social desirability aspect to it. It's like, are you a good employee? They're going to say yes, and then why they're a good employer. Are you a good candidate? And they're going to say yes to that. So always ask sort of a follow-up why question when you're asking some of these questions which have a high social desirability aspect to it. The next question is something that I use for my grad students selection process, right? Tell me a time in which you faced a challenge in a team. Tell me about what led up to that challenge. What was the challenge? How'd you react and overcome that challenge? And if you do it again, what would change? So be conscientious about the skills or dimensions that you're looking to get from these individuals that you're hiring. But this is only in hiring situations. You know, some of the interviews can happen in an informal matter when you're looking for a new colleague, you know, in maybe a Zoom call or something where you can kind of tease out in a more informal way some of these characteristics that you're interested in. I do want to go back a slide and talk about how homogeneity and heterogeneity operate on some of these characteristics here. You don't necessarily need to have heterogeneity on all of the characteristics because, for example, in astronaut teams, we find that you have a lot of highly extroverted people with type A personalities, and that can lead to a lot of bumping heads. And you saw that a little bit in your decision-making process for who you'd select to have on your teams, especially that last group. So you want high levels, you want homogeneity on, say, conscientiousness, right? High conscientiousness, no matter what, leads to good team performance. You don't want like a diversity of people on conscientiousness where you have like one really great conscientious employee or team member and one really low one. But you do want heterogeneity on things like extroversion, agreeableness. Now, agreeableness is a little bit funky because it's like, well, don't you want a lot of agreeableness on your team? But the answer is no. Some conflict can lead to positive outcomes for your team. Now, this is usually task-based conflict. So a point in which you disagree on a task-based component. You don't want everyone saying yes all the time. It will lead to a lack of critical evaluation of how your team is doing, and then lead to mistakes that you can make. There's a documentary on the Challenger tragedy that you can watch that goes into this concept of groupthink that's related to this concept. What we find in the research is that pubs with gender heterogeneity receive 34 more % citations than those with same gender. Having at least one female PI increases the likelihood of funding and innovative ideas. When having postdocs on a grant or a team, it's more likely to lead through breakthrough publications than either grad students or technicians. While involving senior personnel can help you get into those higher impact journals. And usually you see that smaller teams lead to more innovative research. You don't want too many cooks in the kitchen. And this was an example, but we can skip that. So just like a very high level summary of what we covered here in the composition as part of this is that it's not always about selecting the best individual team member. It does not consider how well team members will get along with one another. Interpersonal dynamics, the way that people get along, drive success. You need to ask yourself when starting a new collaboration or bringing someone into your team is like, who's the best scholar for this team? Diversity is critical in various different ways. Homogeneity is only beneficial with some characteristics like conscientiousness and intelligence, but homogeneity can also lead to derivative ideas and adherence to status quo, lack of critical examination with how your team is doing. Many types of diversity, and they all have benefits. And you probably want to keep your research team relatively small. It promotes innovation. It gives you agility to pivot when maybe something doesn't work out. And leading a large team can easily get unwieldy. Before we go into leadership, does anyone have any questions or comments you'd like to ask? Okay, so we'll start talking about leadership now. One thing about leadership is, like academics, we don't get any real leadership training. What we do get is exposure to our mentors when going through this whole process. So when you are a new academic in a new job or established academic, you copy the style that your mentor provided. And that leadership style may or may not be right for you, depending on how good your mentor was at leading. So it's crucial that we mentor individuals not only from a research perspective who are in our lab, but also from a leadership perspective by conveying these opportunities to exhibit leadership, providing developmental opportunities and feedback on leadership, and walking the walk, trying to be a good leader yourself. But what does that look like? And I want to ask that to you all first. What makes a good leader? I'm going to flip the question to the next one. And so you can go to Menti now and give us just a characteristic or two of what makes a good leader. And I'll change the screen that I'm sharing so we can see those answers come in. So we have our first answer: a role model and flexible to adapt to the changing strengths of the team. I love the adaptability aspect of that answer. Someone who is humble, that is a good characteristic to have in academia. I don't know how often we see that. Being vulnerable in situations, that is great. Someone who is reliable and understanding that creates a positive and healthy environment. Someone who is brave, that's a good characteristic for folks to have. A good listener. I love that, popped up twice right then. being a good listener is critical to being a good leader. And standards are clear, so letting everyone know what their roles and responsibilities are. That's a good behavior for leaders to engage in. A good teacher, approachable, good communicator, someone who is passionate. Let's wait for maybe one or two more answers here. A passion for the team members to succeed. So knowing that you're not sort of in it alone. Someone who is accessible, someone who you can go and chat with all the time. I really like that answer as well. So I'm going to switch real quick back to the PowerPoints. Those are all great answers. So part of that exercise is thinking about what you're describing there isn't necessarily, a lot of those things may not necessarily be a characteristic of an individual, even though many of those answers were. Is more focusing on what does honesty, what does integrity look like in a good leader. So rather than focusing on the characteristics of the individual, what we should be focusing on is good leadership, because leadership can come from anybody on the team. And there's many different leadership theories that are out there, not all focus on it. For example, there's transformational leadership, which focuses on these styles or behaviors that leaders engage in. There's leader member exchange theory, which focuses on the relationship a leader has with their followers, not necessarily focusing on good behaviors. Whereas collective leadership, which is the theory that we're going to focus on today, more focuses on leadership roles and what the team needs. And its leadership is not necessarily put into one person, right? When we're talking about leadership on a team, we should be focusing on the behaviors, the actions that folks engage in, rather than a particular person. So on your team, leaders can have multiple roles. So this is what the collective leadership theory says. You'll have a navigator who establishes and maintains a clear purpose and direction for your team. We saw that in some of your responses. We have an engineer who provides structure for the group and the tasks that they are doing. We have a social integrator, which maintains a healthy relationship and productive team relationship with folks on your team. And you have like a liaison. So someone who may be reaching out to external partners or bringing in new collaborators. And if you could think of a team that you're currently on, not one person is likely wearing all of these hats, right? These hats get spread around. It's hard for one particular person to wear all of these hats at the same time. So usually these responsibilities or these behaviors or roles are distributed across an entire team. And it's important to note that these leadership roles may change over time. So think of it this way. If someone drops out for whatever reason, who usually engages in a particular role, someone needs to be there to fill in their place, or may not be appropriate for someone to lead in a certain circumstance. So we have these examples here on the right. So Janet often serves as a social integrator of a team, but has recently experienced a loss in a family. You wouldn't expect Janet's role to continue to be the social integrator after experiencing something like that. Or while Steve is often the navigator of the team, making sure everyone's on a set direction, defining the goals, there's a decision that needs to be made about medical device protocols, an area that is completely outside of Steve's expertise. And so someone else in that scenario should be stepping up to be the leader. And that's completely okay. And it's important that you establish the norm of people stepping up and stepping down and being a leader. So from a leadership perspective, there's this acronym called CARE, which is, as a hierarchical leader, a positional leader, which all of these teams are going to have, you should be cognizant of the role that your team member needs at any particular moment. You should be aware of the leadership needs of each individual team member. You should be ready to take a step back and allow the team to lead themselves when they are ready to. And you should expect to take action outside of your normal or leadership responsibilities. Like if data needs to be cleaned, go and clean the data. If code needs to be written, you can go and code, write some code. So it's always a great leader is someone who is always filling in where there may be deficiencies, which is sometimes really hard, but it's also important for the team to succeed. By doing this, your team should engage in effective team processes, those behaviors that we talked about earlier, and develop those critical and necessary emergent states that lead to performance that we care about. So right now, we're just going to take a 5-minute stretch/bio break, and we'll be moving on from these examples of team inputs we talked about to team processes. So I'll start a timer and bring us back here and start again in about 5 minutes. I'll be sticking around if anyone has any questions during this time too.
Hi, Christopher.
Yes.
I can't hear you. Oh,
yeah, sorry.
I was in team 3. I thought I had put our answers in, but I guess I didn't see at the top where it says that you changed the slide. So I think I was putting the answers into whatever question you asked previously.
No worries.
Sorry about
You're
that.
fine. No, you're fine.
So can I make a semi small talk question about the leadership stuff?
Sure.
Do you study this on undergraduate student teams, or do you focus mostly on grown-ups?
So I primarily focus on the the working teams coming from so I'm in work psychology, so that's primarily where we focus on. Also science teams, which can involve some undergraduates, but there's excellent projects going on, especially at Georgia Tech. They have this VIP projects, which are these.
That's me.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So I'm sure that there's a leadership. I've talked to Ed Coyle like once when I got here a couple years ago, and he had these team-based surveys, and I believe, if my memory serves, there were leadership sorts of questions in there.
We have leadership questions. It's a peer evaluation.
Yeah.
And so we've been able to show that as students stay on the team longer, they take on greater leadership roles.
Yeah.
And the question is, to what degree does the student coordinate things? But right now, we pretty much put the faculty and the students in a room and assume magic's going to happen. And so we're starting to look at, because it's a hybrid between mentorship, but it's also very team-based. So a lot of things that are kind of on the market that would be packages we could use don't quite fit. So, but there's also opportunity for a lot of research, because we have, right now, I think we have 1,600, 1,700 students each semester on ED teams. And some of the teams are 10 students, some are 50 students.
Yeah, and I think some of them have like these hierarchical levels too, where maybe some of the undergraduates in these one component teams don't talk to the undergraduates in another component team.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so we do social network diagrams for the instructors
Nice.
based on the peer evaluation, so they can just see what their team is looking like, but we don't really do any interventions or research on how to change what those might look like, because the professors might all have different goals for their team.
Yeah,
But
some professors may want these teams to be more self-managing, others may want them to continue to like kind of oversee everything that's going on
yeah,
with the team by their own direction. It's a really hard step for folks to take, right? Is that relinquishing of direction or that role when the team is maybe ready to take on that responsibility themselves.
yeah.
So yeah, sorry, was that like I didn't?
Oh.
Is there a follow-up question or?
Well, I was just wondered if there was much research on team science with student teams, and yeah, maybe that's something a direction we can go in the future.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think there should be, because undergraduates don't get any of this sort of training as well, right? They just informally through any labs that they're in. So yeah.
Well, and your diagram of the team longevity that relates so much to undergrads, a lab versus a
It
whole
really
course.
does, with a lot of changing members. And so there's a whole research on team onboarding, which I don't think has been applied to undergraduates. But like what happens when you have like this team that's been together for a long period of time and new people come in? How do you ensure that they're filling some of the roles that were previous that need to be fulfilled, and if not, who is taking responsibility for those roles? How do you make those people feel more accepted, where they can speak up in that sort of environment as well? So there's a lot of research out there on things like that in business teams. More so, some of the research also focuses on sports teams, because those trades naturally happen. But yeah.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So it's been about 5 minutes. I'm gonna keep going with the presentation. So we've talked about this composition and leadership. We've taken a high level, but we're going to move on to these mediators and specifically focus on team conflict for the next little bit. So this whole section is labeled managing, leveraging, and mitigating conflict. And conflict emerges from a bunch of different things. Individuals on your team come from different thought worlds, right? They have different perspectives and experiences in their lives. There's perceptual gaps, which is a differential understanding of maybe the problem or the purpose of the project that needs to be resolved. And when you start trying to bridge these different ideas and the perceptual gaps, you're going to be kind of butting heads a little bit, and that's what causes conflict. So imagine that you have, say, 2 PIs in a room, and then you have a problem that you want to solve, whether that's like, hey, what should we focus on for this particular grant? What funding agency should we go to? What particular division should we go to? What should be the forefront of what we're studying here? And so you have both these sort of functional background, diversity, characteristics, like one may be more in a management role, one may be more of a research scientist, as well as these personal differences in which they came from. So these factors will affect the different ways that they both see the problem space. So they're coming in with their own set of understanding, expectations, and assessments. And so there's going to be a gap there when they start having this conversation initially. And so you have to come to agreement on some of these factors, like what sort of language are we going to do? For example, each discipline has their particular sets of jargon. How are we going to approach a problem? What should we prioritize, or what preferences should we have, even when it comes to like meeting structures and things like that? There's also affective integration, which comes from what activities are we engaging in, or do we value that promote trust? How do we earn respect? How do we develop liking? And when we're trying to get to this point, that is where conflict often emerges from. And that's not to say that conflict is bad, right? Conflict can be very good. So it can facilitate great ideas and creativity. And it's a groupthink where, you know, no one's stepping up and challenging the status quo. It helps identify problems you wouldn't see without having these potentially contentious situations. And it helps you more thoroughly diagnose and resolve, problems on the team. And ultimately, it'll likely lead to more productivity and creativity. But I mean, let's be honest, there's always going to be negative effects of conflict. It detracts from cohesion, how well the team members want to work together in the future. It decreases group satisfaction. It often increases team stress, and then it may also lead to reduced productivity. But it's important. So the questions that we're going to try and address here is, how do you get the benefits of conflict, leaving these deleterious effects behind? And to do this, it's important that we recognize that there's different types of conflict that teams have. There's more work or task-based conflict. So specifically, task conflict is when you have different ideas or perspectives on viewpoints regarding the work itself. Process conflict involves, say, different ideas about how this work gets done, how it should be distributed, what you should be prioritizing, things like that. And then there's interpersonal conflict, and specifically relationship conflict. And so this is interpersonal, like you and I have a disagreement on a more fundamental, personal, social level. And this sort of conflict always leads to bad outcomes. So it's important that you try and resolve this conflict. This is not the type of conflict that leads to those creative, innovative ideas in just about all scenarios. An important aspect of task and process conflict is when you do come and butt heads, how's this conflict initially expressed? So we're talking about emotional and affective expression here. So we're going to go through two different scenarios, and feel free to speak up when we actually a single scenario expressed in two different ways. So feel free to speak up in this next section when we start identifying the differences. So here's version A. Mary tries to explain why she believes the allocation is adequate and even provides a bit of discretionary funds to the project. Tom listens but remains concerned. He suggests that Mary may not understand the hidden costs in the situation and that they may want to discuss the issue further. Mary disagrees. Round two of this is Mary defends her reasoning and unequivocally states that the allocation is adequate and might even be more than is needed. Tom interrupts her before she is finished. He asserts that Mary does not have the expertise to see the hidden cost in the situation and demands that they reopen the issue. And at the end, you still have this Mary disagrees. So it's just like, find a difference between two photos that you do as a kid. But can someone come off of mute for maybe a minute and talk about maybe some of the differences that they see between these two versions?
obviously the difference is about letting Mary finishing her whole like argumentation. The only thing is that I think the best way would be version C, if I could say, because it's never it's always a concern, let's say, as a person, when you hear someone else telling you, one, either you don't have the expertise, or two, you don't understand. I'm not sure that's the best way to say it, like something along the line of, you may not know the hidden cost. I think that's something even better. Turning it in terms of, here could be a learning, it's a learning experience for you to know how to allocate your funds. I think that might prove more fruitful in terms of the collaboration, instead of just being like, you don't know. Like, it's just, it never works to be frontal.
Yeah, I mean, but you're still coming up with the same sort of like the problem, the thing that you are bringing to their attention is the same outcome, right? There's something that Mary may not necessarily be aware of in the situation. You have no idea why, right? So when you're doing this and you're expressing this, there's two different things that you can do. One, focus entirely on the task thing, right? Which is maybe Tom is aware of unhidden cost that Mary doesn't know about, and it wants to share that information. That's all task-based stuff. It's not an attribute on Mary. In both these scenarios, you're right, C is probably better. Tom is having a conflict or expressing a conflict in a way that is a criticism of the person. So Mary herself in here. In version B, it's a lot more aggressive, right? It's like, you don't have the expertise, versus version A, which is not excellent either, but we're never perfect. Mary may not understand. So in one approach here, it's a little bit less of a expression that gets on the person. In version B, it's totally like you shouldn't be doing that.
Don't want to spend too much time on this, but I disagree on one thing still. Like,
sure.
We don't know who's right in this situation. Like, the way it's phrased right now, obviously because it's phrased in a sequential manner, you might think you're led, for us, like the spectator, like the audience, we're led to believe that Tom is in the right. We have no idea. Maybe Mary did take into account the hidden costs. Like, maybe Tom is just actually not in the right in this. It's just that you never want to assume that you're the one who holds all the keys, especially if you're like going to collaborate with someone for years. It's not just like a one-time student. I mean, they're coming with a one-time situation. If you're supposed to work with that person for years, there are two outcomes always when someone comes to you: dealing with the fact, but dealing with the person also.
Yeah, no,
At
you're
least that's what
absolutely right. No, you're absolutely right. We cannot make assumptions in this scenario of who's right and who's wrong. But I think one of the takeaways here is the way in which it's being addressed. And we just talked about 4 different ways that we could talk about it here. So I agree with you. Any other differences that folks see? Well, I think we can move on here, but yeah, it's really focused on the expression. When we hit that with the first person who participates. So Mary tries to explain why she believes a particular thing. versus, you're starting off on a bad note already. Like Mary defends her reasoning and unequivocally states that the allocation is accurate. In version A, you're opening up to further discussion. In version B, it's already sort of, we better not talk about this. It's a non-issue. In version A, if it is an issue, Tom listens, but remains concerned. So he doesn't take necessarily any action there. In version B, he interrupts her before she actually finishes. In version A, he's trying to be a little bit more keeping the door open to further conversation by suggesting that she may not understand, and provides an opportunity for discussing this in the future. In version B, he asserts something about Mary's expertise and demands they reopen the issue. Both lead to Mary disagreeing, but neither is going to be productive. One is going to be a little bit more productive for their team performance going forward. So the way that you express conflict matters. What we could do with conflict expression is put them on this two-dimensional sort of platform in terms of intensity versus directness. So conflict can be expressed in a very intense and direct way. This is never good. This is when you're actually arguing about things. There's clear disagreement and evokes defensiveness. This will lead to negative conflict spirals. It will lead to an increase of information, but not an increase of information relevant to the topic that you're talking about. And it also will lead to negative emotions within your team. The second type, of conflict expression is undermining. So this is pretty intense, but it's not necessarily clear, what the target of the conflict is. So this is like dismissing, teasing, and complaining. While this will lead to less negative conflict spirals because it's not, very direct, it will also lead to a lack of important information that needs to be discussed, while an increase of negative emotions with all parties involved. The third type of conflict expression is disguise. It's ambiguous of why there is a conflict. No one will necessarily know because all of the actions are behind the scenes. Now, depending on who you are with on a team and your interpersonal dispositions, this may lead to more conflict spirals and may actually lead to more intense and direct confrontations, but it's unclear whether it leads to the type of information being shared and expressed and the negative emotions being expressed, because nothing is necessarily being targeted here. So there's a lot of variability in terms of what happens when conflict is expressed in this fashion. The best way to express conflict is with a low intensity but high directness. You need to make sure that contentious points are clear and calmly presented. This will likely lead to less conflict spirals, more positive information being shared, less negative emotions, and hopefully, after the conflict is resolved, increased positive emotions. So the take-home strategies I want to give you here is something that you can sort of take with you if you're building a team with folks, is that there are some preemptive strategies that you can take. You should have maybe some collaborative agreements or welcome letters. So these agreements set clear expectations, establishes the teamwork dynamics on your team, like who is working on what roles do folks have, and it promotes trust. Also within these collaborative agreements and welcome letters, there are questions that around situations that may be conflictive in the future. So it'll discuss how disagreements are resolved, or any impediments that may stop you from being productive are also written down so team members are aware of them. When conflict actually happens, it's important that you engage with that conflict in some way. It's never great if you ignore that conflict. Try to direct the conversation that you're having with these individuals, or if you're involved in a conflict yourself, towards some sort of shared interests, because you need to address the desires of both the people in the conflict situation, which will likely lead to increase in agreement at the end of the day. It's important that you never make it a hierarchical power situation. Be aware of your power dynamics in those situations, and don't make it personal. Whatever criticisms or critiques you may have, or information that you want to bring up, it's important that you try and steer that away on critiques of the individual themselves, and be a role model yourself. Try and follow these steps when you do have a conflict with other individuals. There's a lot of different research on different conflict resolution styles, but we're not going over that today. But there's 4 R's to remember after a conflict has occurred, right? You need to resolve. So ensure that the particular conflict episode has been resolved by both parties in separate sorts of meetings, so they don't feel pressured to say it's resolved just to move on. Reflect, discuss the conflict and how it could have been handled differently. Engage in strategies that help repair the relationships that may have been damaged during the conflict, and then release it. The conflict episode should not have any long-lasting interpersonal implications. So we have about 15 minutes left, and we're going to move from conflict and talk about psychological safety and trust quickly. So psychological safety is the shared belief that group members will not make fun of, ridicule, punish, or humiliate you for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. It's about being comfortable with being vulnerable. What psychological safety is not is being a nice and agreeable and complacent. Not all ideas are great suggestions. It's important that you discuss all those ideas, but not accept and integrate some of those ideas that people know are bad. It's also different from trust. So trust is feeling safe in knowing that someone can do their job, or you can rely on them for any collaborative activities that you may have. So trust is more knowing that you can rely on a person, while psychological safety is feeling safe and comfortable expressing something that may be potentially contentious or makes yourself vulnerable. Psychological safety is fantastic for all aspects of teams. It promotes learning because issues regarding things that someone critiques are more easily brought up, so everyone can learn from them. It increases resiliency, innovativeness, performance, belongingness, respect, feelings of voice from your team members. They can feel like they can speak up more, as well as the well-being and happiness of your team. So it's important that we promote psychological safety in our team, and it all starts with communication. So if you're going to everything in terms of the processes, the emergent states and outcomes, it all starts with communication. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition for you to develop these emergent states, to coordinate with one another, and to finally get the outcome that you desire. Effective and ineffective teams may communicate the same amount. Research shows that they're usually talking about the same. But what is different is what they're talking about. So ineffective teams usually share information that everyone already knows, while effective teams share unique information that people don't know, that may be potentially contentious, that may challenge the status quo. So if you want your team to be effective, you need to ensure that they have an environment to be expressing these unique pieces of information. Unfortunately, there are some barriers to developing psychological safety. There's structural factors like the climate in your organization and or department. If there's like a really strong hierarchy, the people in the power distance factor may prevent people from speaking up. There's also ambiguous job descriptions where it's not clear if someone should be making themselves vulnerable about a particular issue because they don't know if that's part of their job or not. Individual factors, personal factors may affect this. If I'm team oriented, if I like working in teams, that may promote me bringing up these issues and help develop psychological safety on the team. Different personality characteristics influence their preferences towards psychological safety, as well as your self-efficacy or your confidence in your oneself. If you're not feeling incredibly confident, whether that's generally or in the moment, you're less likely to bring up something that makes you vulnerable, as well as norms and cultures. If there's a particular department or school norm that you are adhering to, or if you have this sort of climate from a previous lab that you're bringing to a new lab, that could either facilitate or prevent the development of psychological safety. So when there's a lack of psychological safety, team members aren't speaking up, they are not pointing out errors that happen, they're less likely to discuss interpersonal mistreatment that happens on a team, and they're more likely to behave in a way that preserves the status quo. And that may not be good if your status quo is a very poor climate. When this happens, when there's not psychological safety, teams aren't learning anything new. They aren't experiencing mistakes or failures, or I'm sorry, teams experience more mistakes and failures, but importantly, they're not bringing them up, they're not learning from them, and they're generally unhappy. They don't feel supported, they don't feel respected, and they don't feel like they're part of the team. So instead of a small group discussion, given that we have about 9 minutes left, I'd like folks to come off mute for a second and maybe share about a time in which they didn't feel safe to speak or take an interpersonal risk. Why did they feel that way? Maybe tie it back to the barriers or not. And did your teammates know that you were feeling that way? What actions could your teammates have taken to make you feel like you could take this interpersonal risk? And while you're thinking of that, I'll give an example of my own. Is when I wanted to move in a different lab in graduate school and I felt like I was being mistreated, there were not a lot of signals or signs from the person that I was working with that means that they would be open to that sort of discussion. And so in those moments, I tended to just, go back into myself and, preserve the status quo of being in that lab, which was not best for me and was not best for that lab at the time. But it also bled over into task situations as well. So like if there was a particular scale that I didn't think that we should use, or if there was a particular critique I had about it, I didn't even want to make myself vulnerable on a task specific level because of the signals that I got from my mentor suggesting these things were not open to discussion, to suggest that the voice that I have was not valued. And so it just led to a poor situation. my teammates knew how I felt, the lab knew how we felt in those situations, but we really didn't do anything about it. What we could have done is maybe be more collective in our action and had a conversation with our advisor in those points, but that unfortunately did not happen. So I'd like to hear from you if you have maybe an example that relates to maybe barriers that came up that stopped you from having psychological safety when you were in a collaborative environment. That's okay if folks can't think of something that they would like to share with the group right now. So we can just move on to what factors you can do to promote psychological safety. So ensure that you have clear and transparent expectations, which means that in whatever team that you're operating in, whether it's like a research team or a lab, there's bi-directional agreement on the goals that you are, or the roles that everyone has. There's recognition for why particular voices are needed at any time, that voicing your concern about issues are important. And it's highly important to acknowledge that it's a team effort and that you have this interdependence. You're dependent on one another to get these things done. Aside from that, at like a kickoff stage, you should be proactive in engendering voice. So model curiosity, reinforce and commend people for when they bring up points that lead to more curious factors, and be empathetic towards individuals as well. You can also lead by being vulnerable, which may not have necessarily worked in that previous exercise, but acknowledge your own fallibility, point out your own mistakes, and so that maybe someone will feel comfortable sharing with your team as well. And follow through, I think, is the most important point. Walk the walk. Don't shoot the messenger when they bring up maybe a critical point for you. Allow people to express their voice. Have structural sort of dynamics in your team that allow opportunities for people to express their voice. So just some quick closing remarks and resources. Actually, we could just share these slides with everyone because it goes over some very specific steps that you can take with your graduate students and some tools that you can use, as well as potentially with postdocs as well. Even there's things that you can do for yourself. You can always get a mentor, develop a plan, and reach out to other folks when you're trying to engage in more effective teamwork. I have a slide here that talks about where does this fit in with promotion and tenure. This essentially just goes over the language used in the Georgia CTSA, some Georgia CTSA universities, about the degree to which they value interdisciplinary and collaboration and teamwork. So they do have some language in there. So it will help specifically you in a lot of cases. So recap, we went over some really high level team constructs. We focused on two inputs, team formation and leading your team. We talked briefly about conflict and psychological strategy, and we just had these closing remarks. So that's about it. We will have some upcoming sessions, so please be a lookout for those two sessions. We offer free consulting services for folks who are attending today. This 1 hour, about an hour one-on-one, either or one with your team, meeting with a team science scholar. In this case, it would be me. There's an evaluation survey that we really would like you to fill out, and it has the information there if you want to sign up for these consulting services. So this is a new program, and we could really use your feedback. And that's it. Thanks everyone for spending the last 2 hours with me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.